the land upon which we stand, which is Darumbal country. We work very intensively with the Darumbal people on our programming and on our educational things, on our exhibitions. They're real friends of the gallery and have been absolutely crucial in what we've been doing here over the last 4+ years. I'd just like to pay my respects to them on behalf of the team here. I'm 42, right? And honestly, I feel like the last 6 months has been maybe the most crazy, scary, anxiety-inducing in terms of everything going on in the world, including our own country, which is often a little bit sleepier in terms of these big headlines, but we've had some pretty scary stuff probably on as well.
Yeah, it's a tricky time to be a human, I think, and if you're in the visual arts and you're working to become an artist or practicing art, I think you'll all know by now that art is about thinking about the world, about trying to respond to the world. There's a new term called solastalgia, which I think all of you younger guys have grown up with, and it is a part of who you are, and that is about the anxiety that comes with your knowledge and fear of what's happening to our climate, and it's no different here to anywhere else in the world at the moment. But then as an artist, I think the thing is, on top of that, you can make work to lessen your solastalgia, to lessen your fear of climate change, but also make work to talk about anything, and I mean anything. And that was one of the things that I think through art school I learnt about art, that art isn't all about beauty. Art can be about, and I often ask my children, and it's worth you guys, everyone in the room, thinking, what is the number one thing that stresses you out at the moment? You don't have to let anyone know. But every single one of you, especially you younger people, have a hell of a lot of pressure on you. Not just through the whole school system, but I remember thinking, why do you get forced to wear a school uniform? When my son was 4, he used to wear dresses, and he was such a flamboyant, wild little kid. And we took him from that into a uniform with a tie for the next 13 years. And after 2 days, he said, "Dad, you know how when you do something over and over, it gets a bit boring? I don't want to wear this tie anymore." And it was day 2 of 13 years of having to wear a tie. I thought that was pretty unfair. So you guys, on top of solastalgia, on top of having to wear a school uniform, on top of having to fit into a system that we've had to set up to try and help you become operatives in our massive mechanical machine that we call Western democracy, you also have the shit that is just ran through your head when I asked you what was the most stressful thing that is in your life at the moment. And it could be about parents divorcing, it could be about a sick sibling, it could be about facing racism, it could be about having no money, it could be about not knowing what you want to do when you finish school, it could be about a bully. But on the same token, you can also make art about what makes you the happiest. Art is about everything, and I can't tell you how lucky I am to be an artist, and also how honoured it is to meet all you guys who are all studying art, because for me it's the most important job in our society.
You know, you've been a professional artist for 20 odd years now, maybe longer actually, now that I think of it. Have you noticed any particular changes in that time that have really affected you or your ability to create?
Well, look, there's huge pressure on art schools at the moment, and art syllabuses in high schools are under a lot of pressure because of that. Universities are constantly, right around Australia, shutting art schools and music academies down because they take up real estate, therefore they're expensive to run. Your degree to go to art school under the last government doubled, so you have to repay this massive debt. It is harder than when I was at art school, and probably also you, Jonathan. But I think that's the thing. If you have something that really stresses you out and you want to try and answer that question or solve that problem, art is the perfect vehicle to do it. And if you're driven to do it, nothing's going to stop you. And I always think that the best art often comes out of the most hardship. So the harder your issue, the harder your problem, the more you love something, the more you're scared of something, the more you're disrupted by something, the better your art will be and the more dedicated you'll be to doing it. So I kind of think bring it on. Make it hard for you guys. You're already dealing with a lot of stuff growing up in this world. Don't be dissuaded, and definitely don't listen to a careers advisor if they tell you not to go to art school. You give them my phone number.
To all of the students in the room, I apologise if you feel like I'm making this all about you, but in a way I kind of want to, because potentially you're the next generation of artists, and potentially, I hope, some of you will be exhibiting here before too long, if you haven't already. One thing I just wanted to do, and I apologise if it's a bit classroom-ish, would you mind sticking up your hand for us if the visual arts or the arts more broadly is something that you would be interested in pursuing in some sort of a, whether it's beyond school or as a career, or would you mind putting up your hands?
You better all put up your hands. No, I'm joking.
That's good. Because there is a bit of a prevailing attitude, I think, particularly in Australia, that it's a dead end and it can't, you won't end up using it. But I can tell you that the arts, very broadly, you will be applying that to everything you do in your future. And yeah, it's great to see so many hands.
Can I just ask a question of the adults in the room? Can you put up your hands, please, if you've studied art at some time in your life?
Yes.
And can you put up your hands if you wished you'd studied art at some times? It's pretty much every single adult in the room. I'm just putting it out there. I also think the other thing worth saying is that in the arts, this is something that was lost on me at art school, and they didn't teach this properly, in my opinion, is that I thought going into the arts meant being an artist. But going into the arts is about making your brain bigger and thinking about the world more constructively, and there are so many jobs. You could be the next Jonathan, who also has a studio at home and makes art, but he's the boss of this unbelievable building. And there are so many staff, all the guys who are in here, working in here, studied at art school, to then work in a place like this. And I tell you what, I was a builder's labourer for 4 years. I didn't want to keep doing that for a 5th year. So I think it's just worth putting out there that a degree in the visual arts or in any sort of humanities will send you in great directions no matter what the outcome.
I have a question. You said that you think that being an artist is the most important things that you can do. Could you talk more about that? What you can justify that?
Yeah. So I as an artist, I'm an activist as an artist. I use my art to tell stories, to argue against the status quo, to try and change things. The only other way that I can see myself doing it, and it's been suggested to me, is become a politician. But politics is so fraught and so disabled and so dysfunctional that I have a much bigger voice by being an artist. And I would argue that I'm making more social change than most politicians. And that's why so many politicians come to me and try and get me to join their team or speak up for their cause. But they are affected by daily polls. Whereas I go away to my studio and I can turn the radio off and I can ignore everything for 12 months if I want and focus on what I'm doing, on honing my story, on creating material that starts to enable me to speak with my visual language and also with my voice. And I'm not going to, I'm an atheist, I don't believe that I'm going to heaven, and I'm not going to waste this life sitting around not standing up for causes that come before me all the time. I have a deep sense of injustice, which I think I was born with, and you guys would be the same. I remember seeing a little girl when I was in year 3. Her name was Magda Calusi. She was an Italian immigrant kid, and every lunchtime the boys in year 6 would pull her ponytail and take her food and smash it into the ground because of the type of food she ate. And I remember it broke my heart when I was in year 3. And I thought, if I was strong enough, I would bash those boys. Now, there's no point using violence, and I don't condone violence anymore, but I went through a very violent part of my life. And for those of you who aren't white guys, you know what it is like to face racism in Australia. I remember one Prime Minister, some Prime Ministers ago, saying, "We are not a racist country." He was a straight white man. Telling us that there is no racism in Australia is absurd. So for me, art, and other artists in here, Tony Albert's on the wall up there next to me, incredibly political artist, making change in very nuanced, very sophisticated ways, in my opinion, far, far above politics.
I'm really curious about what work you're creating at the moment and what sort of issues you're addressing at the moment.
Yeah, so over the years I've often been, I make work and then something comes before me and I respond to something. So I've been, in a sense, quite responsive in the way I practice my art. And I'll give you an example. I was contacted by a barrister who said, "You've been making works about young masculinity." Some of my first works earlier than this were about my young mates at bucks parties. All you guys who are about to turn 18, it's a number picked out of, and you know, some of you were fully fledged adults physically when you were much, much younger than you are now. And some of you, like me, I wasn't really seriously physically a man until I was probably 19. Everyone comes to age at a different time, but we picked this date out of the ether, 18. You're allowed to drink a massive amount of beer the night before. When I was young, we would drink a yard glass of beer, spew all over yourself, wake up the next morning and you're a voting adult. It's insane stupidity. So I started to make works about my masculinity, about the young men that I was with. I then was contacted by a barrister, as I was saying, who said, "I'm acting for a man on death row in Bali, in Indonesia, Myuran Sukumaran," and I was so intrigued to meet that man. I started talking to him on social media. I asked him to do a practice. He was making paintings of Hollywood celebrities out of magazines, and I said, "Why are you painting them?" And he said, "I think people would be interested in them." I said, "I'm much more interested in you." And I said, "Make a self-portrait every day." And 2 weeks later, his barrister sent me a photo and his wall was covered in self-portraits, and I was hooked. I went to Bali over 30 times in the end, and he ended up being executed for drug smuggling. He became a very beautiful man. He was forgiven by a lot of people. Some people filled with hate and racism, to be honest, never forgave him. But I made a lot of work about that period of my life. So I respond to things that come before me, and often they're tied up in notions of human rights and justice. At the moment, I'm working on a really big show at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, and the working title was Solastalgia, that word, which is about the fear of climate change. Again, I'm just responding to how I've been feeling. I've been really anxious that our government is not doing enough, no government is doing enough to fix these epic issues that we are facing now, and we are in the middle of a mass extinction event at the moment. We've lost over 100 species extinct in Australia, just in this country, and no one seems to be talking about it. So I'm making a show that responds directly to that, to my fear. I never thought I could, because I thought this issue is too big, but that was actually, to be honest, cowardice on my behalf. Come on, step up. Of course I can make work about it. It can be a bit bleak, but I'm actually using Santa Claus as a figure throughout the exhibition to bring a lightheartedness to it, because Santa's a funny dude. You know, my brother put my son to bed when Joey was 3. My brother, who I didn't think was very paternalistic, I didn't think he cared much about kids, he came and stayed on Christmas Eve, and he said, "Can I put your Joey to bed?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so honoured, and what a lucky uncle and what a lucky nephew." And he put him to bed on Christmas Eve, and Joey came running out an hour and a half later saying, "Daddy, Daddy, a big fat man who smokes cigarettes is going to break into our house tonight and drink your beer." And I was like, "Yeah, that's right." And it gave me an idea again. Right then I thought, yeah, if you take off all the leather off a bikie, that looks like Santa Claus. Santa Claus in leather. That, you think about it. Santa Claus is a big beard, big fat dude. I reckon he's got tattoos all over him under that red suit.
I was just wondering if you had a point in your life where you ever wanted to give give up art, or you lost your passion, and if so, how did you move forward and regain that passion?
It's a great question. To be honest, every morning when I get into my studio, I don't want to be there. It's a hard job. I'm often on my own. You have to come up with constant ideas. But just like the mates that I work for who are plumbers in Sydney as a builder's labourer, I remember them getting to the roofs out in Western Sydney and it would be 0 degrees and there'd be ice on the corrugated iron, and they would put all their tools in a warm bucket of water so their hands didn't freeze, and they would climb onto that roof at 7 a.m. and start working. And it was a real lesson for me that art is the same. You have to show up and you have to do it. And I meet lots of young artists say, I can't get into an exhibition, and then they show me what they've made in a year and it's only a couple of works. They're not actually working. They don't have a proper practice, which is like yoga practice or football practice. You have to do it all the time. So most mornings I get to the studio and think this is going to be crushing. I'm hopeless. I'm the worst artist in the world. By some afternoons I think I'm the best artist in the world and I love this job. And that's what happens every day. So you just have to go in there and do it. And the more you do it, the better your practice becomes, and the better you become not only at making interesting work that speaks to the audience, but also better at actually doing it. It's a good question.
What was that Chuck Close you said it last night, and it's such a terrific analogy.
Chuck Close is a very famous American artist, very famous and brilliant, and someone asked him about writer's block or inspiration, and he said inspiration is for amateurs, the rest of us go to work. And you could actually put that on any of your parents who are successful in their job, anyone you know in the community who's good at their job. Jonathan is a museum director. He must be really doing his job well. He's got the big gun job. It's the same, but it is the same. You don't show up and go, I don't feel like doing anything today. I'm just going to go and drink coffee in the cafe all day. You know what I mean? And it's the same for everything in life. It's the same for school. If you don't show up and do it, you won't get the mark you want. And as an artist, working for myself on my own and paying a home loan and having 2 little children, you have to work.
Thanks, Ben. That was a really good response. But I actually just wanted to go back to what you were talking about before with your show that you're working on at the moment. How would you then go about using your method of communicating and putting forward an idea about climate change? Would you find that hard to do for an even a younger audience?
No, look, firstly, we in Australia wildly underestimate young people. I've written a graphic novel for the NGV show, and it's about Santa Claus, and one of his reindeer I'm giving you the story away, one of his reindeer gets hit by a missile. It's fired by probably a Russian, and it kills his lead reindeer who he loves. So he thinks, you know what? Humans don't deserve me anymore. The tundra's falling apart. The reindeer don't have enough food. I'm leaving, and he goes to the South Pole. And the graphic novel opens with this big fat dude in his underpants covered in tattoos. And the people who are helping me on the book said, oh no, this is not age appropriate. What, are you kidding? Kids are super smart. In fact, you guys are more sophisticated in terms of contemporary culture and what's happening in the world, in your community and your histories and who you know and how the world's changing. Contemporary music, rap, everything that's happening. You know more than any of us about what is actually happening in the world right now. We underestimate our youth, and it's because of that stupid 18 date, I think. Until then, we don't treat them seriously. They know exactly what they're doing. They have serious and fierce anxieties about the world, and they're right to have. And I'm sure a lot of them, if they really think about it, are pretty dubious about the people, us adults, which I also pay credit to. So the show for small children, I want it to be tactile. I'd love to do a show one day where kids can touch everything in the show, little kids. But saying that, little kids aren't, I don't want to ruin the Santa myth. I hope none of you guys still believe in Santa. It's a joke. Yeah, for little kids it's a different thing. It's about tactility, and there's some huge epic things happening in there. There's lots of sounds. I recorded penguin colonies in Antarctica when I was there. I'm messing around with a 2019 model Mustang. We're turning that into a huge speaker that plays a penguin colony back at the audience. I'm scanning a tree stump that I found in Tasmania that's 8 metres across, and we're rebuilding that in the museum space. So there'll be a lot for little kids to wander through, and there'll be a Santa's cave that I want only kids who are, you know, have a height thing, which is a bit flexible so that slightly taller kids who want to go in can get in and no one else is allowed, but apparently that's a safety thing. Can't do that.
Ben, while we're talking about kids, I was really curious about how you maintain such a prolific level of output as a parent of young kids.
Well, to go back a bit, my wife is a writer, and when she married me, when we got together, she was a very successful writer. She was writing TV dramas and winning big awards and very successful. And she did marry a bit of a bum. I had no money, no job. I was finishing builder's labourer, saying, I'm an artist. She says now she thought, she never doubted that I would make it. I don't know how, and it might be some of her magic that made that happen. And when we had children, I had to take over, and I started working much, much harder. A lot of people said, when you have your baby, you'll make paintings of the baby. I thought, you kill me. How kitsch and stupid is that idea? But for any of you who have had little babies in your lives, little siblings or children yourself, they penetrate your psychology when they come into the world. And I did lots of work about, particularly my son when he was a newborn. That's all I could think about. It was overwhelming. And they're some of the most personal works I've made just about parenting. Again, that referencing your question earlier, just responding to what is right there. That's something I'd say to all you young guys. There's so much pressure on you to come up with these wild ideas, but it's actually definitely right in front of you. And it could be about the saddest thing happening in your life at the moment. And that is a really valid and actually seriously important thing to make work about. To talk to the world about how you're feeling makes some of the best art that's being made in the world. And we want to hear your voices. So art doesn't, as I said before, it doesn't need to be about beauty. It can be about sadness, hardship, sorrow, or happiness, or beauty.
I don't really have the idea formed about what I'm asking, but I know that you studied in Australian Indigenous Studies, it's what it used to be called in Australia. And I guess I haven't seen that as hugely reflected in your practice as I would have anticipated, and I am curious as to why it's not explored more in your practice, considering it's something that I feel you'll probably really, really feel so strongly about.
No, it actually is. I've been making works for 20 years, and they've never been shown together, but they're all the Rorschach paintings.
Yeah.
All the big Rorschach landscape paintings. I work with community. Nick Mitzovich of the National Gallery called them the massacre paintings, which I'm a bit uncomfortable with. And it goes back to, I was at art school. I went straight to art school from high school, and halfway through it I failed, and they kicked me out, and they said, if you leave and defer for a year, we'll let you come back. And I was furious, the indignity, how dare they? But it was the greatest opportunity I'd ever been given. And I went around Australia with a mate, and it's the last time I was in Rockhampton was when I was 19 years old in a beaten up VC Commodore station wagon with Damien Fenley, my mate. And we were learning an Indigenous language. We had a book and we were learning Pitjantjatjara. And we got to a road stop near Airlie Beach, and this is 94, something like that. And we were camping in a pretty disgusting way. We had 2 bits of foam in the back of the car which we'd just lie on the ground, and the food and crap and stunk in there. Hadn't washed clothes for months. And there was a young Aboriginal guy living at the road stop, and it was on a creek, and he caught mud crabs, showed us how to do it. We became mates. He travelled with us for a while, and he killed, the first night we were there, the tourists, old white people, were feeding possums in a tree, and he walked over and belted it on the head and cooked it and taught us how to cook it, and it was a privilege and pretty wild for those white tourists to see. And that night around the fire, we thought we're going to show him our language, try and say a few words. And he laughed and laughed and laughed and said, it's Pitjantjatjara, mate. That's got nothing to do with this community here. And I had no idea back then that there was more than one Indigenous language. How shameful is that? I went right through the education system and had no idea that there was more than one Indigenous language. So as soon as I came back, I enrolled in Indigenous culture and history at Monash Uni, and I did a 2 certificate course. So it was not a huge thing, because I then came back to art school, but it started a lifelong inquiry. If you notice my work, there's not a lot of women in my paintings. There's mostly men. I feel that it's not some big political statement I'm making. I feel that I have a right to make work about myself. And if I'm making work about anyone else, I need their permission. And those massacre paintings are incredibly fraught. I have to work with community to make sure they are comfortable with me making that work. I work very closely with them. I've made a lot of good friends. I also had some of my best mates. Warwick Thornton's a filmmaker, Western Arunda, Tony Albert, who's in this show. I have good friends who I constantly run things by to get their feedback. But there's a massive show of those Rorschachs to happen one day, and every single work is about a different site of Indigenous massacre. So I've actually been making those works more solidly than any other part of my practice. It is the one thing I haven't stopped doing, but I'm not overt about it. I think one day there will be a big show of the works, and then I want the communities to come forward and talk about their history. If you remember that when I was at art school, there was a man named Keith Windshuttle who said that there was no frontier violence, that there was never a shot fired against an Indigenous person, and that none of it happened. He was employed by the federal government at the time, by John Howard, as his chief historical advisor. Now, for those of you who know what propaganda is, that to me is a propagandist. He was making up crap to rewrite history, to have basically a revisionist model of a white history and forget that Indigenous people existed. My greatest privilege of being in this country, and I always say I'm Irish-blooded, 100%. Both my parents were Irish Catholics. I was the first to marry outside of the Irish Catholic faith. My parents aren't practicing Catholics, but that was the way Irish Catholics were. Calling myself an Australian with 100% Irish DNA after 4 or 5 generations on a country that we still, up until very recently, had people in federal government level denying that anything went wrong, that they handed this country to us. It is a fraught thing to make work about. I don't make paintings about Aboriginal people. I make them, in a sense, about these beautiful sites that we go as a tourist, and I want people to remember what actually happened on those sites.
Are you ever hesitant to share an artwork of yours because people may find it controversial or interpret it differently?
It's a great question. Yeah, there's some reviewers who just really don't like anything that I do. And sometimes it's really disturbing to have to go to work in the morning. And I've been working on this show that's coming up, which is going to be called The Wastelands, about environmental destruction, for 3 years now. And by the time it comes on, it'll be 4 years. And I could almost write the review before the reviewers even seen it. I know what 2 of them particularly, who are really top-tier reviewers, are going to hate it no matter what I do. I don't really understand why, and the older I get, the less I care. You have to be... That's the one thing about being an artist, is that you can't hide. But saying that, I'm not performative. I can switch social media off. I don't have to read comments. I don't have to listen to what anyone says. I just put it out there, and I don't even have to be there when it's seen. As an artist, nothing is out of bounds, nothing. You should be able to make work about the most taboo topics in your life, in the country, on the planet. That is what our job is. And for some people that's just too much. And there is definitely, I think, a sense in Australia at the moment, probably it's always been there, that artists overstep the line. We often, and authors, I mean, I have friends who are authors, Anna Funder and Richard Flanagan, who write very critical things about governments and about the way society works, and they are loathed by many people. And that sadly is part of the job.
Do you have any advice for someone who is struggling to fall in love with their own art, and they love to do art, but they always hate their final product?
I haven't met an artist who thinks they're great yet. So that's probably what you've just got to deal with for the rest of your life. I was so nervous about coming here and seeing that painting up there, and I was sure that it was really shit, and I was going to go, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. So it's just normal. I think that's part of being an artist, is that you're loaded with self-doubt, and you've got to just push through it and keep going. And remember, you make one bad painting and then you make 10 bad paintings, but slowly they improve, or they don't. Or you have an exhibition of 10 bad paintings that could be great, that you don't realise are actually really interesting and speaking to each other. The most important thing, do you have visual arts process diaries? Do you have those things? VAPD? Yeah? The thing about VAPD, I see my studio now as a VAPD. My whole studio has become a working diary. But no one sees that studio. It is really, really private. And for a VAPD, it's really hard to be honest with yourself if you know that all your friends are going to see it. It's hard not to want to show people when you think you've made something good. My advice would be to maybe have one VAPD that's for everyone and another one that's just for you. And then you be really, really bluntly honest in there, and forget about trying to make something good. Just try and make something that's honest, and it will be good, because your truth is your truth. No one can argue with you about your feelings, about how you feel about the world, about your anxieties. They are very real. Respond to that, and you can't really go wrong, I think.
Would you be able to talk to us about the pieces that you have exhibited here today? And especially on the back wall and that. I had a student that was a bit disturbed by it, and it would be nice to hear your thoughts on the process of creating.
Yeah, I'm a bit disturbed by it. And a disgusting sort of green colour. Who would do that? So that painting, often I'll get into the studio. I remember a politician, and this is an example, a politician up here somewhere after the Christchurch massacre where 50 people got shot in a mosque. One of the politicians up here came out and said that the Muslims had been asking for it. And I was so angry. And that day I went to the studio and made one of the ugliest, greatest paintings that I've ever made about that man and how angry I was. And it was a much better way than tweeting out my fury on social media. Much more constructive, much healthier for me. And that painting up there is like that. I made that after the election of Donald Trump. I just felt like humans and the environment and the way we're treating the environment is a perfect example. We just keep stabbing ourselves over and over and over and over and over again. And I felt like we just have these skins that we pull off or pull on to forget, to ignore the fact that things are going wrong around us, to ignore the fact that maybe our neighbour is lonely, or that the world is falling apart. And that's really simple as what that work was about. It's not a really deeply sophisticated meaning, but just about the way I felt about us collectively, that we're sort of ignoring what's coming at us. And this one here was just a straightforward portrait. I was running late for school with my kids in the car about 10 more years ago, and I pulled up to a man with a lollipop sign, a stop sign, and I was running so late. And I wound down the window and I said, "Can I take a photo of you?" And he said, "Yep." And I just took a photo and drove off. So not many are from photographs, but I couldn't pull out, my studio on the side of the road for the lollipop man. I had to take a photo. And it was so puzzling to me that he didn't say why, didn't seem to care less. And I made the painting and I couldn't find the man. He wasn't there again. And then only recently I saw him on the side of the road. And I stopped, and he was very moved. I showed him photos and he couldn't believe it.
Have you ever made an artwork about someone else's artwork that you didn't agree with and showed your own point of view of it?
Of someone else's artwork? It's a good question. No, I reference other artists a lot, and I look at a lot of other artists. But no, I don't think I've done that, not so directly. I think one of the things I feel is that when I was at art school, there was no mobile phones. And the first computer in my life was when I was 15. There was no such thing as a computer. We had Game Boys. There was no telephones and definitely no social media. And now I have young friends who look at lots of art, but they're only looking through their algorithm, and their algorithm pushes them, like my Sydney friends, young friends, they're only looking at other artists in Sydney, which is crazy. I was friends with Margaret Olley, a very old artist, very traditional, beautiful, still life flower painter, and she told me once that they would order a book. She said, I remember ordering a book of James Soutine, a French artist, and the book came from Paris, and it took 2 months to get to their house. And then they had a big dinner and a party to celebrate the book coming, and they spent the whole night looking at the book. But Soutine is one of the great masters of painting, and they spent a lot of time looking at that rather than looking at 100 really average artists. I think that's the problem with social media, and I don't look too much at art because I'm too busy making my own art.
What sort of music do you listen to?
What sort of music do I listen to? Everything. I've been having a bit of a Megadeth period. But I'm a huge classical music fan. I have a friend who is into world music who's given me lots of stuff over the years. I really do listen to everything. And I have music on all the time in my studio. Because when I don't, I just start to get a bit freaked out by the sound of my own breath. And I'm on my feet moving, and you start going, and you can hear it, and you think, what is that? It's me. And I don't think you want to be so in your body. Like, this idea of getting into the zone for me is very real. Once you start working for the first hour in the morning, one of your questions, for the first hour in the morning it's pretty hard, but before too long you just start to go. And before you know it, the day's finished because you've just been and that noise, I think your heartbeat and your sound of your breathing becomes a bit of a clock that you don't want to hear ticking. So I always have music on.
Ben, thank you so much for being here and taking this time. You've been incredibly generous. Thanks all of you for coming, especially all of these school groups. It's so great to see you, and I hope that you know you're always welcome in here. We look forward to seeing you again. Would you please thank Ben for his time?